Evening, everybody. I'm Janice Kaminer-Resnick, and I'm pleased to welcome you from Jews United for Democracy and Justice and for Community Advocates, Inc. As this is our last program of 2020, we wanted to take a moment to reflect on this year. When the COVID quarantine began in March, we canceled our pending in-person programs and quickly put our heads together to figure out how to continue our work virtually. Within a couple of weeks, we planned our first virtual program for April 22nd. At the time, we had 3,000 people, almost all of them from Los Angeles, on our email list and had been attracting around 500 people to our monthly in-person programs here in LA. On April 22nd, we presented the outstanding Jennifer Rubin of the Washington Post and were blown away when 1,000 people registered. For our second program on May 6th, our featured speaker was none other than Bret Stephens, who's with us tonight. 1,200 people registered. And the growth curve steadily continued until tonight, when we have a record tying 5,500 people registered for tonight's program. Our list now includes some 15,000 people from every state in the union and from almost every continent in the world. Over the course of these 37 weeks, we have remarkably sponsored 37 programs. More than 120,000 people have registered for our programs, and our average audience size is around 3,000 people per program, though tonight we will have many more. We set out in March of this year to plan a series of programs that would underscore threats to our democracy. We aim to bring you the best and the brightest thinkers in the country, and we think you will agree that we have accomplished that goal. Thank you to our audience for your persistent interest in the pursuit of knowledge and understanding and your loyal devotion to our democracy. As long as you continue to demonstrate your interest by attending these programs, we will continue to deliver. As you all know, the task for our country is not as simple as winning an election. Rather, it will take a dedicated and informed public to restore and then to ensure preservation of our democratic norms. But there is a proverb which sometimes is attributed to Atlas, and other times I've seen it attributed to ancient Jews. No matter who said it, it resonates. We ask not for a lighter burden, but for broader shoulders. Thank you to my amazing partners on our leadership team, most notably Zev Yaroslavsky, Mel Levine, and David Lehrer. As we plan these programs, we share scores of emails and phone conferences every day. We are all volunteers, and we are engaged in a labor of love. We know we are succeeding in our efforts because you, our audience, has spoken loudly and clearly. Here are a few of the comments from the hundreds we have received. Quote, "Your programs are a lifeline to factual, sensible information." Another said, quote, "My Wednesday nights at 5 are sacrosanct." And another said, "The stature of your guests amazes me each week." And finally, quote, "Wednesdays at 5 are the only silver lining of this COVID nightmare." We want to thank our amazing speakers and moderators. Their commitment to our democracy and to informing the public is paramount, and we are very grateful. And we want to thank our wonderful co-sponsors, Temple Isaiah, Stephen Wise Temple, Valley Beth Shalom, Temple Beth Am, Leo Beck Temple, ICAR, Temple Israel of Hollywood, Jewish Center for Justice, the Holocaust Museum LA, the Forward, and the Pico Union Project. Happy New Year. Let's all pray that 2021 brings health to our homes. And to those in our audience who celebrate Christmas, we wish you a very happy holiday. Finally, when we started this virtual series on April 22nd, 44,762 Americans had died of COVID. As of today, 323,000 Americans have died from this terrible disease. We mourn for those whose lives have been taken and dedicate tonight's program, which is the last of this year, to their memory. Now, the amazing David Lehrer has a few words and will introduce our speakers. David Lehrer has.
Thank you, Janice. On behalf of Community Advocates, I'm pleased to join you in welcoming all of you to another of our America at Crossroads virtual town hall. This is the 36th in our weekly series. As we look back on over 9 months of programming, as Janice mentioned, I want to join for a moment in the tuning of our horns. In addition to the registrants for our live broadcast, YouTube has informed us that our programs have had nearly 24,000 views there and a total of the hard-to-believe number of 427,000 minutes of watching. That comes out to nearly 300 days of absorbing the likes of Bret Stephens, David Brooks, George Will, Nicholas Kristof, and our numerous other thought-provoking guest speakers. Additionally, several of our programs have been broadcast nationwide on C-SPAN and clips on CNN, The Hill, and several other news stations. But most indicative of our achieving the goals we set for ourselves are the countless emails and letters, as Janice noted, of appreciation we get from viewers. Your thank yous for the quality of the programs, for the educational impact, for the hope that they often engender, and perhaps most meaningful of all, for their impacting of your lives really touch us. A note we received just this week from San Gabriel, California concluded, the speakers and content have influenced me to be more thoughtful and informed. We couldn't ask for more than that. Our programming over the next month and a half is continuing apace with a lineup of great speakers and moderators. You'll be kept abreast with our emails and at the end of this program. It's now my pleasure to introduce Bret Stephens. Bret is a Pulitzer Prize-winning columnist at the New York Times after 11 years opining at the Wall Street Journal. He's also a senior contributor to NBC News. We've had him speak from our podium both in 2017 and earlier this year. He is always a pleasure to listen to. And I think the over 5,000 of you who registered for tonight appear to agree. A moderator is Henry Weinstein, a professor of law at the University of California, Irvine School of Law. He was a legal reporter for the Los Angeles Times for decades, garnering part of 2 Pulitzer Prizes and the prestigious Columbia School of Journalism John Chancellor Award that recognized his body of work for its courage, integrity, curiosity, and intelligence. Awfully impressive credentials for both our guests. I wish all of you who are celebrating a Merry Christmas and to all our viewers a happy, healthy, and safe New Year. Henry?
David, thank you very much for that kind introduction. And I want to say good evening and thank you to the audience for joining us. The topic of tonight's program is, can we heal after Trump? Without challenging the premise of our topic, I think we first have to acknowledge that there is a big question as to when or whether there will be an after Trump, or at the very least, when there will be an after Trumpism. Normally after presidential elections, the postmortems are rather granular, such as, why did Biden lose a county that the Democrats hadn't lost in South Texas for years? Or why didn't Trump win Michigan this time? And while those topics are still being discussed, bigger issues are now on the table, ranging from the unprecedented question that you don't have to be a Cassandra to ask of, what happens if Trump says he won't leave on January the 20th? But perhaps more cosmically, just how fragile is our democracy? As Janice said, as we gather tonight, 323,000 Americans have died from COVID. There are 18.3 million who've contracted the disease. Those numbers are considered to rise a great deal after the holidays. Unfortunately, some people in the country regrettably still don't even believe that the disease exists. I've heard interviews with nurses saying that their patients say they couldn't really be dying of coronavirus because they don't believe something like that exists. Regrettably, it is not an understatement to say that a chunk of our population have chosen to be members of a contemporary flat earth society. Facts have lost meaning for them. President Trump has encouraged this behavior while no words of sadness or condolences emanate from his lips about the coronavirus. Meanwhile, as you know, he continues to contend that he won the election by a landslide, even though Biden won by 7 million in the popular vote and got 306 compared to 232 electoral votes for Trump. Judges around the country, including have rejected claims that of Trump's lawyers that he won the election. And 3 of the justices that Trump appointed to the Supreme Court himself said that a case that Texas filed on his behalf was not even worthy of being heard. But yet we still wonder what's going to happen on January the 6th in the Congress, when the normally mundane task of bringing forth the electoral votes and for approval is taken. Who knows? Trump, as you know, has continued to issue pardons under strange circumstances, including just today for Paul Manafort. And there were more than a dozen last night. And last night he did something quite dramatic. He said that he wouldn't approve the package that had been approved for coronavirus relief, said that people deserve to get more money. Of course, Democrats said they were happy about that, but it's unclear what will happen. And at the very least, it appears that relief for the hungry and the unemployed is going to be delayed. So they got the proverbial load of coal for Christmas. On the upside, some people in the country, as you know, have gotten the vaccine, which is hopeful, but we just don't know how many people will get it and how soon that they will get it. So At the moment, I think it would be very safe to say that the country is deeply divided. And I think that you have to be more than optimistic, and I consider myself an optimist, to think it'll change in the near term. So I'd like to start the conversation with Bret by asking him to talk about two of his recent columns. I'm not going to limit him to talking about those, but there are two in particular. The first one was published on November the 23rd. It said that Trump had contrived a stab in the back myth, and Bret compared it to events that occurred in Germany after World War I. He wrote, "The main point of Trump's post-election legal assault was not really to overturn the election results. Rather," Bret wrote, "the point is to deny the legitimacy of the Biden presidency, of the electoral system that gave him the office, and of the federal and judicial system that turned Trump's legal challenges aside. In other words, it was an assault on our democratic system." Bret, I give you the mic.
Well, first of all, it's such a pleasure to be at least virtually in the same space with you. And I want to thank David and Zev and everyone else who brought this program together for me and for all of your other really illustrious speakers. Now, to the question about your column, I just want to preface it by saying that I think that column shows the benefit of having spent some time in the company of professors at the University of Chicago, because one thing that happened to me, at least at that school, is that it enlarged my historical and philosophical horizons in a way that I think remains relatively uncommon today. You know, you had mentioned earlier, Henry, whether there's any real question as to whether Trump, the man, will leave office. And I have to say, I can't see any scenario in which Trump, the man, doesn't leave office, not least because I'm convinced of the patriotism and fidelity to the Constitution of our men and women in the armed services and the people who will ultimately maintain the norms of democracy. But you added a caveat, which I think is really important, which is whether Trumpism will ever leave office. And that's a distinction that needs to be made. Trump doesn't simply represent a cult of personality, although he is a cult of personality. Trump represents a culture of illiberalism and of a consistent, I use this word advisedly, philosophical assault on the moral, constitutional, and value-based underpinnings of a liberal democratic society, which is why I, as a Wall Street Journal editorial board conservative, was so vociferously opposed to him from the moment practically that he announced for president. I think in my first column about Trump, I compared him to Hugo Chavez. And I think that comparison remains a relatively apt one. So what Trumpism, the persistence of Trumpism, is the persistence, first of all, in a fact-free universe in which truth is whatever the president or his minions can get away with at any given moment in time. So in that sense, it's a sort of epistemological assault on our understanding of the world, and it's also an assault on basic constitutional norms. We have never, and I say this, never in American history have we had a president, a sitting president, who has refused to recognize not only the results of the election as declared by the media and every reputable news organization, but refuses to declare the results of the electoral college itself. And that's quite staggering and something really quite new and extraordinarily worrisome, because it is transforming the set of norms and values that are kind of the quiet, invisible underpinning of any successful liberal democracy. You know, liberal democracy is not simply a matter of having checks and balances, a Congress, an executive, and a judiciary. It's also the kind of values that inform the people who live in those offices. And he is debasing and degrading those values in a way that I think is more dangerous than anything we've ever seen. And in that, I include the presidency of James Buchanan and any of the sort of lowlights in American history. There are people in this audience of now a few thousand who who probably thought that it could never be worse than Richard Nixon. But Richard Nixon looks like a paragon of rectitude and virtue compared to what we have now. And it is extremely concerning, not because of what happens over the next 30 days, but to me, what happens over the next 30 years as my children go into their adulthood as citizens in this country.
Thank you, Bret. And that sort of tees up the second column of yours that I wanted to talk about, which was published on December the 14th. It took a slightly different tone, saying that Trump had done considerable damage, though not as bad as some had forecast when he came into office. But then you came in with the big line where you said, the catastrophe of Trump's presidency doesn't mainly lie in the visible damage it has caused. It's in the invisible damage. Trump was a corrosive. What he mainly corroded was social trust, the most important element in any successful society. Why don't you elaborate on that?
I mean, I think this is an important point because in many of my conversations with some of my old conservative friends who are more indulgent of the president and of his record, they'll say, well, look, you anti-Trumpers or never Trumpers said that we'd have thermonuclear war, that we'd walk out of NATO, that Vladimir Putin would basically run the country, that we'd never have another election in this country, and none of that happened, and that means you're just hysterical, right? That was the argument from the beginning. This is the point that I made in this column is not one I was making for the first time. From the beginning, my real fear about Trump was that word, laying that word corrosion, which is that he was sanding down the kind of the inner, the invisible aspects of the structures of American politics to the point that you would never quite know when they were liable to snap. And the most important aspect of any successful political, of any successful society and political enterprise is this thing that we call trust, social trust, trust in one another, trust in our institutions. Now, it is true that Trump, to some extent, represents the culmination of decades of declining trust in institutions and in one another. But he was also, in his own way, an accelerant of that collapse in trust, which of course is now happening, in, as I said earlier, is in an unprecedented way. Look at societies around the world. Look at low trust societies. Let me take one example. Lebanon. Does Lebanon appear to you to be a successful society? I don't think so. And it has a lot to do with the absence of trust between various Lebanese communities, religious communities, ethnic communities, and so on. Brazil is a low trust society, also has deep problems on that account. We are no longer Sweden or Switzerland or Singapore, those high trust places. We're moving in the opposite direction. And I think that when social historians look back on the early 21st century and ask what really went wrong in America at that time, they're not going to say the economy went wrong. They're not even going to say the pandemic, as bad as those are now. They're going to say that Trump was the moment when Americans lost faith in their institutions, in each other, and ultimately in themselves.
Let's unpeel that a little bit more to get to one of the seed beds of that. Right now, there seem to be legitimate beliefs by millions of people that Trump won the election. I think some of his followers believe it more than Trump does himself. So one of the questions is why are some, in the past, say, for example, when I was in college in the 60s, people had debates over the merits of what the United States was doing in Vietnam. People had debates over the United States' policies toward Russia or Israel. These were kind of, basic debates about things where there was some basic grounding in facts. Now, some people just seem to resist facts at all. I mean, there is no evidence that has been put forward whatsoever that Trump won this election, but millions of people seem to believe that he did. What do you think accounts for that?
there's someone on this call who's not on mute, and maybe it would be great if they made sure they muted it, because there's a feedback. Sorry for the interruption. Well, look, this is again part of the corrosive aspect of Trump's presidency. You know, in 2004 or 5, a professor at Princeton, who's Harry Frankfurter, I believe, double check that name, wrote a very memorable philosophical tome with the title, forgive my language, On Bullshit. And he identified bullshit as a sort of distinctive category of thought and expression, which was neither true nor false. It was bullshit, right? It was what you thought you could get away with in a manner that was just sort of divorced from the regular rules of discourse and debate and trying to sort out fact from fiction. And at the time that it came out, I remember thinking, oh, you know, what a clever professor to come up with a serious philosophical tome on this you know, category of speech. I mean, little did I know that in 10 years' time or so, bullshit would be the reigning form of discourse in American politics, or at least in a section of American politics. And it's why I think Trump is not simply sort of foolish or idiotic, but profoundly dangerous. I gave a speech at UCLA a few years ago, the Daniel Pearl lecture, where I talked about this, that Trump's idea of truth is whatever he can get away with at any given moment of time, in time. And that's really, it's dangerous, right? For precisely the reasons that you suggest, because it makes conspiracy theories, it makes outlandish thinking respectable, and also not only respectable, but in a sense, I don't want to say defensible, but in its own kind of universe, let me say that, put it this way, it's impervious to argumentation. It's self-reinforcing. This gets back, by the way, to the first column that I wrote about the stab in the back myth. You know, Trump's idea that the election was stolen from him, of course, has no basis in fact, in truth, but all it has to do is reinforce the animating prejudices and desires in the minds of the people who wish to believe it. And it was that kind of fact-free thinking that contributed to the disasters of the Weimar Republic and ultimately the rise of Nazism. I just want to underscore, I'm not comparing Trump supporters to Nazis, but the kind of fact-free thinking and conspiracy theorizing that was pervasive in 1920s Germany is the kind of intellectual atmosphere we have today.
That's pretty frightening. This morning, one of your fellow New York Times op-ed writers, Thomas Friedman, made a bold prediction, which I would like to quote. He said, if Trump keeps delegitimizing Joe Biden's presidency and demanding loyalty for his extreme behavior, the GOP could fully fracture, splitting between principled Republicans and unprincipled Republicans. Trump then might have done America the greatest favor possible, stimulating the birth of a new principled conservative party. Do you think that's possible? And picking up from Friedman's construct, how would you describe the difference between what he characterizes as a principled Republican and an unprincipled Republican?
Well, I'd like to think that a principled Republican is someone who from the beginning understood that Donald Trump represented a threat to a set of values that transcend partisan questions and that have to be opposed at any cost, including the cost of office and reputation. And so, you know, whatever else people think of might think of me and my opinions one way or the other, I have always felt that my duty is to have maintained a consistent stance about the I don't want to say the unacceptability, but the disaster of Trump's presidency. Now, my hope is that because Trump lost and because he's going out with such characteristic gracelessness, to put it mildly, that there will be some kind of partial awakening among Republicans and conservatives. And I noticed just yesterday or the day before, Pat Robertson, to my amazement, not someone I've ever agreed with on very much, actually, acknowledged what most of us have known for a long time, that we have a profoundly deluded president who's now also a loser. And so this might form the basis of some reconstitution of a more normal Republican Party. But I have to say, I'm very despondent on this point. I mean, once you see someone, you can have a friend for years, and suddenly you discover some horrendous aspect in the character of your friend. It becomes very difficult to unsee it, right? And what I can't unsee is that when many of my fellow conservatives had an opportunity to stand up against a person that at some level they understood was completely unfit and immoral, they didn't take the opportunity to do so. And by the way, this is not like standing up to the Nazis and facing the prospect of Buchenwald. This was just saying, I'm not gonna go along with this. So I have a hard time unseeing it. On the other hand, I've always loved the parable of, if there are 10 good men in the city, will you not destroy it? From Genesis. And I think there are at least a few of us who didn't lose our basic conservative bearings on questions like taxes, regulation, other sorts of issues, but who maintained a kind of a consistent point of opposition to this presidency. And how that work goes about, I honestly have no idea. I think that's going to be a work that's going to last a generation. And I think you're going to have a deeply fractured Republican Party in the meantime.
It seemed to me that when he dissed John McCain, that was a fault line, that people did not respond to that at all. And as I suspect you probably know, within the past few months, Ann Applebaum, who's a scholar of totalitarianism, wrote a very pungent piece in The Atlantic about collaboration and talking about why people collaborated and what the rewards were for collaborating, because it sure looks like a lot of Republicans, or Republican office holders, I should say, saw benefits in collaborating, right?
Well, I'm leery of the term collaboration. It has too much of a kind of a Vichy association, and I think that if we're going to heal this country, we have to be very measured in terms of our thinking, and in terms of especially our thinking about the motives which led many people to vote for Trump, because many people who did vote for Trump did so for reasons that included the fact that they couldn't stand the guy and wish they didn't have to vote for him and wish that it weren't an option. But I do think that if collaboration isn't the term, something that happened to Republican politics in 2015 happened around exactly that episode that you mentioned, the moment when Trump dissed, if that's now a word, John McCain's heroic service in Vietnam. Within a couple of days, Rush Limbaugh rushed to Trump's defense. And he rushed to Trump's defense because Trump would refuse to apologize for speaking so horrendously about McCain's wartime service. And this became a kind of a pattern. That was, to me, the beginning of a pattern of a kind of a moral inversion in the Republican Party, where the point wasn't to honor distinguished and heroic military service under conditions of immense stress. Real courage in the mind of Rush Limbaugh was a kind of a shamelessness, which is to say, you might say I've said something terrible, but I don't care, right? That was the genesis of it. And so shamelessness became confused and conflated with courage and virtue and manliness in the minds of a great many Republicans. I mean, what is the secret of Trump's political success? He doesn't apologize. He doesn't back down. That's what the secret sauce of that style of politics. And there's going to be, I think it requires a certain kind of deep moral pedagogy to rescue people from thinking along those lines, because what conservative politics has now become, Henry, isn't really what I used to know of as conservative. Smaller government, for example, a strong defense, international alliances, a belief in the values of a free society, and all the rest of it. Conservative politics under Trump became basically a form of anti-liberalism. So if you're a liberal and you say X, I'm always going to say Y. Why? Because by doing so, I'm owning the libs, as someone says, and that's a kind of a nihilistic form of politics into which too many Republicans fell. Again, how you're going to pull tens of millions of people out of this is a separate and a very difficult question.
Okay, so as you said, you think, and I don't disagree with you about this, that Trump will leave the White House on January 20th. Biden comes in under a greatly difficult circumstances, a horrible economy, pandemic, fractured country. What areas are there that you think that Biden might be able to achieve any common ground with on the Republican Party as it now stands, particularly given that, McConnell, certainly tried to stop most everything that Obama did, and certainly, shown signs that he will do the same thing with Biden. I mean, Trump, at least from the point of view of some Democrats, I would say that Trump is not the only problem.
So my suspicion, or my hunch, I should say, is that Biden is going to have a very good presidency. And we are going to find ourselves 20 years from now erecting statues to Joe Biden and naming aircraft carriers after him. And it might not appear that way at the beginning, but that's how we'll remember it in a way that we might remember George H.W. Bush's presidency as a very successful presidency. And even in some respects, Jerry Ford's presidency going back. Neither of them popular or blessed with re-election at the time, but in hindsight, important presidencies. And I think Biden is going to be able to govern, provided he attempts to govern by picking his spots and finding the places where he can pick off the 5 or 6 moderate Republicans who, the problem-solving caucus, who can be won over to comprehensive immigration reform, to a massive and jobs-producing infrastructure bill, to a new look and new approach to our foreign policy, particularly with respect to East Asia, to thinking through police reform in a way that respects the risks and the sacrifices that police officers take, while understanding that millions of Americans feel that they are being disserved and underserved by police forces. And that really is going to come down to President-elect Biden, I should say, to Biden finding or reminding himself of his inner centrist. He won the Democratic nomination against candidates who were far to the left of him because of that moderate instinct and that consensual instinct that seems to run very deep in him. And if he can be true to himself, if Joe can be Joe, I think he's going to have a very successful presidency. If he makes the mistake of running left politically, I hope he doesn't, not just because I'm conservative, but for the sake of his presidency, it's going to be a much more fraught 4 years.
few moments ago, you mentioned 30 years from now and your children. One of the cornerstones of a democratic society is a good public education system.
Yeah.
And for the past 4 years, we have had a Secretary of Education. In fact, I think she's maybe the only person who's lasted the 4 years in Trump's cabinet, who has basically, I mean, most of them have left at one point or another. And she has been very hostile to public education. And also she's been very hostile to the marginal of society, refusing to grant refunds to students who got ripped off by profit-making vocational schools. And what are we going to do about the public education system in this country? Because I think part of that relates to the fact what you've talked about a lot about having a fact-free society.
Well, I mean, I think it's immensely important. This is slightly to one side of your question, because I never followed Betsy DeVos closely enough to really have a particularly informed opinion, and I don't want to just mouth off. But I do spend a lot of time thinking about the dearth of civics education in the United States and the extent to which when there is a civics education, it tends to be not particularly robust. I mean, certainly not the kind of civics education my mom got when she was in the public schools as an immigrant child in the 1950s. I think that's really essential. And if there are people listening in who are involved in this work, figuring out, even if it's outside of public schools, but if it's reaching children, how to create, how to make them understand what not only the United States is and ought to be about, but what liberal democracy is and ought to be about is really is a really vital task. I've been thinking about the title of this talk, Henry, for a few days, and it seems to me that if you just taught 5 Lincoln speeches in school, you would go very far to saving the country and mending the rifts between us. We should teach Washington the temperance speech from 1842, in which Lincoln talks about persuasion and the importance of what he calls a drop of honey draws more flies than a gallon of gall. That persuasion, winning people over to your side, not by hitting them on the head, but by convincing them to join your cause, is the essence of what makes for a successful democratic society. We should teach the Cooper Union speech of 1860, which ends with that ringing endorsement, let us have faith that right makes might, that we pursue our interests most fully when we put our values first. Let's teach the full meaning of the Gettysburg Address, and particularly, why does Lincoln begin with the words 77 years ago? Why that's so important to date us as a country to the ideals and values of 1776, however hypocritically they were honored or not honored by the men who wrote them. And finally, that wonderful phrase from the second inaugural, with malice toward none, with charity for all. Malice toward none. I think that's extraordinarily important, especially now. I really think if you just taught those speeches and maybe one or two others that I can think of, we would be going a far distance towards improving the kind of the thinking and the caliber of people that our public schools produce each year.
Well, I think that's a fine idea, and I'd recommend to you and to anybody else in the audience who hasn't yet read it, a fantastic book that's come out in recent months called Lincoln on the Verge by Professor Ted Widmer in New York. And it's a book about what happened between the date of his election and the date of his inauguration, and the parallels and the fracturing of the country are quite strong now. Now, I know that you've had, I just want to turn to a couple other things. You've had a strong interest in foreign affairs, and you've expressed concern about the U.S. role on the world stage and whether the U.S. can ever regain its role on the world stage. So why don't you talk a little bit about that, Bret?
Yeah, so look, I mean, I wrote a book in 2014 called America in Retreat, and the subtitle was The New Isolationism and the Coming Global Disorder. This was a period when many people were saying that the world had kind of stabilized after the first decade of 9/11 in Iraq and so on. I was fairly grim about where we were going because I felt that there was an isolationist mood on a bipartisan basis. And there is more continuity in Trump's foreign policy from his predecessor than I think either man would care to admit, in the sense that there is this emphasis that the United States should really mind its own business and take care of itself first, rather than maintain the kind of international structures that defined American foreign policy throughout World War II and much of the Cold War and the immediate period after that. Trump has done grave damage to that, even though there have been areas in foreign policy where I've in fact agreed with the conclusions or some of the policy of the Trump administration. And the gravest damage that he has done is he has undercut the idea that the United States should lead the world chiefly by providing reasons for our allies to follow us. And that begins with setting a kind of a moral tone, a belief in burden sharing, a belief in championing certain kinds of values, like, for instance, the rights of the Chinese Uyghur not to be sent to concentration camps in Western China, or of journalists and Saudi journalists not to be murdered in diplomatic consulates. These are touchstone requirements of global leadership. And it's a global leadership that has to be reckoned as extraordinarily successful, in the sense that because we've had, on a bipartisan basis until Trump, reasonably capable stewards of American policy, a lot of countries have thought a lot of our friends have thought, well, we're a country that's worth following because America is not in it for itself. It's not America first. That's changed. And there is the Biden administration, but also whoever succeeds them, is going to have to work very hard in restoring that. Above all, they're going to have to work hard in restoring the ideal of an open society, a society that's open to talent, a society that's open to ideas, a society that is not afraid of the religions or beliefs of others, but thinks that we are actually enriched by a multiplicity of beliefs, creeds, and so on. I'm not naive, by the way, about what I'm proposing, but I'm talking about the general tilt in our thinking. And all you have to do is go back to speeches by Ronald Reagan and George H.W. Bush, who I don't remember as being, woolly-eyed liberals, to realize that there was a time when Americans, including most conservatives, believed this, and we benefited from it, and we still can. Again, it requires more than just policy. It requires pedagogy. It requires explaining to Americans why we are safer in the world when South Korea is safer from North Korean aggression, and why Lithuanians are safer from Russian aggression, and why Israelis are safer when they can sleep well in their beds and not have to fear rockets from Hezbollah or Hamas.
So I'm going to start posing a few of the questions that came in from the audience. And one of them comes from a person named Avi, who asked, you define yourself as a conservative. What elements of conservatism do you embrace that distinguishes you from your liberal friends?
Oh, I mean, look, I'm a low tax, small government, deregulation conservative who also believes that we should spend abundantly on defense to keep any challengers from even thinking about trying to reach parity with us. I am very hawkish when it comes to how we deal with Iran and the threat that it poses. I generally think that judges do their jobs better when they stick to the letter of the law and the Constitution than when they try to interpret it according to their own convictions. I mean, I was a very conventional conservative up until 2015 or so. But when I say I'm a conservative, it ultimately means I'm a conservative within the broad universe of liberal values. I believe in tolerance. I believe in free speech. I believe in the benefits of a plural society. I don't claim to know and speak for any authoritative truth beyond an opinion about which I myself am skeptical much of the time, right? And in that sense, one of the things that the Trump presidency did is it made me realize that I had much more in common with many of my liberal friends than I think either of us had previously recognized, because we had these values in common. I think there are really two political movements in the United States today. Not Republicans or Democrats or liberals or conservatives. I think there are liberals and there are illiberals. And by the way, there's a lot of illiberalism on the left as well when it comes to forms of identity politics that descend into a kind of a tribalism. The Bernie bro phenomenon is often a very ugly phenomenon. I can go on at length about this stuff, and I find it very problematic. But I find that when it comes to friends of mine who are Democrats who share these basic values, the belief in immigration, by the way, is I'm the son of a refugee. The idea that the United States would try to cut the number of refugees we take in to zero makes me physically ill. And what I'd like to do is advocate a politics, whether it's a little bit on the right or on the left, that stays squarely within the four corners of that classical liberal tradition, which believes in the rights of the individual, that person's dignity, and the opportunities that a decent society should afford those people.
Just for a second about immigration, that's been a cornerstone anti-immigration of Trump's policy. That, I mean, been, you know, the idea of you mentioned that you were the child of a refugee. He was a person who, you know, sanctioned putting children in cages, and there are still 700 families that nobody seems to be able to connect these people. They didn't put much effort into it. I mean, it is, you know, when you think about the United States on the world stage, it seems to me that's been kind of one of the most disgraceful aspects of this presidency. And getting to your point about the US's role in the world, that certainly hasn't helped us to look like we're a beacon for human rights.
Yeah, I once wrote a tongue-in-cheek column which enraged Tucker Carlson. I consider that one of my greater achievements in life, in which I said, you know, we really need to get rid of all these lazy sloths who are, you know, ruining American society with their bad behavior. Let's throw out any American who's been here for at least 3 generations and welcome more immigrants. Because if you actually go down the list of, you know, starting businesses, staying within the law, stable families, religiosity, all of the classic conservative values are generally best represented by immigrant communities, more so than those of us who have been here, you know, for several cycles. I wrote that in jest because obviously I'm not for throwing anyone out, but this is massively important. And by the way, this is something that really distinguishes the American ideal from other nation states in Europe. People become Americans simply by adopting a set of fundamental values. And one of those values has to be recognizing the rights of the people who are just behind us, a step or two behind us in line, to have the same opportunities that we did. You know, before the age of Zoom, I used to do a lot of public speaking. And at one point in one event somewhere in California, I asked a very wealthy audience, I said, you know, there are people who are serving you at your tables right now. And there are people who are going to come after you leave this auditorium and who are going to clean up. And I want you to look at those people and I want you to understand one thing. They are your grandparents. Because I know that that's what my grandfather on my father's side was doing at the Brooklyn Navy Yard about 115 years ago. And if you can't see that those people are the same striving, ambitious dreamers that your grandparents were, and whose children went on to become successes and entrepreneurs so that you could enjoy your life, then you just don't understand what this country is about.
Okay, thank you. Next question comes from a member of the audience named Paul, who says, you've lived and written a great deal about Israel. What's your perceptions of what's going on there now?
Well, they're having an awful lot of elections.
Yes.
Look, I mean, Israel is a country that has the geopolitical dilemmas of a superpower, and the politics of a shtetl. And it's, anyone who knows Israel knows that there's this kind of curious mixture of, the high drama of war and statecraft and weapons of mass destruction, all these large issues, but Israeli politics themselves are incredibly local. And this is a country that has about the same population as metropolitan New York, and about the same size as New Jersey. And speaking as a Jew, it's not surprising that its politics are as sort of fractious and boisterous and sometimes problematic and sometimes hair-raising, as in fact they are. But look, it's a large argument. One can have a large argument about how you can reform the Knesset and the structures of Israeli politics to get something a little more regular. There was an attempt 25 or so years ago to move towards a somewhat more presidential system, which fell apart. But the deeper structures of Israeli political life are actually remarkably stable. And I don't just mean that in terms of the continuity, Netanyahu's continuity in office. I mean that in terms of the basic bureaucratic structures, the military, the way Israelis lead their lives. My greatest concerns when it comes to Israel aren't with politics, they're with society. And they're really internal to Israel, even beyond the Palestinian question. And I don't want to make light of the seriousness or slight the seriousness of that question, but it's really about the integration of Israeli Arabs, which has been, shamefully retarded and denied, and that's a real issue. The question of Orthodox, or if you want, ultra-Orthodox Jewry, and its integration into Israeli life. There's an old joke that in Israel, 1/3 of the country pays taxes, 1/3 of the country serves in the army, 1/3 of the country has a job, and the tragedy is it's the same third, right? How do you fix that? I am very confident, having lived in Israel and having covered it for well over 20 years, that Israelis will figure it out, and that it is in fact the most robust liberal democracy in the world today. I have deep anxiety about the future of the United States. I have considerably less anxiety about the future of Israel.
Okay, all right. Going back to January the 20th, we have a question from the audience. Do you have fears of violence on January the 20th or in the immediate aftermath of Biden's inauguration? As you know, we've had election officials threatened with death, kidnapping plot of the governor of Michigan. It's not a pretty picture.
Yeah, I do. And I think, that speech by that election official in Georgia, I forgot his name, but I think everyone watched it.
Burger, yeah.
Was a speech that we will remember. And we will remember it especially. Look, it's not that I think that Trump is going to inspire his followers to commit violent acts. What he's going to do is inspire people who are deeply deranged to commit acts thinking that they are, in a sense, fulfilling what they think he's telling them. And to some extent, he is telling him that. I mean, the line about the enemy of the news media being the enemy of the American people haunts me, and especially haunts me given threats that I have received. I mean, I'm only speaking because I have personal knowledge of this, threats that ultimately led to the arrest and imprisonment of very unstable individual, right? And other journalists have similar kinds of stories. So I think we are simply waiting on a moment when there's going to be a tragedy. The temperature has been raised so high by the demagogy of this presidency that it's not going to cool down. It's not going to cool down very quickly. And he has created a universe of true believers within which there's always going to be one person or a few people capable of doing real damage. So that's something that I and colleagues at the New York Times and other newspapers have given a lot of thought to. And taken measures against, I should add.
Yes, yes. We've got a number of questions, again, going back to people in the Republican Party and the questions about why do you think that they have sort of enabled Trump, or at least not stood in his way, or said something about John McCain or Charlottesville or Cages. I'll just pose this in one way. So Mitch McConnell, I think, just got elected to his 7th term or 6th term. I mean, he's, in his mid-70s. He's well off. I mean, what is there for somebody like that to fear at this point? He's not like a freshman who has no seniority.
Yeah, well, I mean, politicians are in the business of getting themselves reelected for the most part. And, invertebrates frequently define the people who inhabit Washington. So, look, I am myself astonished. One of the things, again, going back to the University of Chicago, I spent a lot of time reading the literature of the totalitarian era and just finding myself in awe at the courage of people like Sakharov and Sharansky and Solzhenitsyn, who were prepared to speak and write against a regime that genuinely could do terrible things to you, send you to mental institutions, to gulags, poison you. Think of someone even today like Alexei Navalny and that kind of courage. I mean, look, I moved jobs, but it didn't take a lot of courage for me to say this guy is totally unacceptable as president, and I'm going to keep saying it, even if I lose a few lunch dates, in the process. I don't know. I wish I could understand why it was so difficult for so many of my former fellow travelers and friends and comrades on the right to come to the same, in my view, utterly obvious judgment. And I think it comes down to this, and I know we're running out of time. I think it comes down to this notion that liberals or progressives are the enemy. And maybe it's because I'm married to someone who's well to the left of me. And so I'm, I guess, sleeping with the enemy, if you will. But I refuse to see other Americans who just happen to have a different point of view as my enemy. I might think they're stupid, foolish, wrong, misguided, or whatever, but they've never been my enemy. And I'd love for American politics to come back to a place where, at a minimum, we never see someone who just takes a different view or is on a different side from a partisan point of view as anything other than a friend. There's a great line in Washington, and I think this is a great line for politics. One should never have enemies. One should only have friends or potential friends. I think it was Cy Karam, the founder of AIPAC, who said that. It's a beautiful line, and it's something for everyone to think about.
Well, that's an admirable goal, and I would just like to add a quote from Solzhenitsyn, since you just mentioned him. There's a quote from Solzhenitsyn that President Obama mentions in his recently published memoir, where Solzhenitsyn says, "The lie has become not just a moral category, but a pillar of the state." And it seems to me that's sort of a hallmark of the Trump administration. And as you said, we're running out of time. You have any closing comments you would like to make?
I'd like to just make a closing comment in this sense. It is, to me, a really good sign that people like you and David and Janice and Zev are maintaining through this a really vibrant civic life in Southern California, but really, everywhere in the United States, and that thousands of people are spending a portion of their evening engaged in these kinds of conversations and this kind of idea making. And it's, we live in a world in which the people we most frequently hear from on Twitter, on social media, on some of the cable news networks are very good at making themselves loud, not particularly good at listening, but they don't necessarily represent what most people want, what most people are, the kind of politics that we desire. I'll just leave you with a small point. Every week, except this last month, Gail Collins and I have a conversation. She's liberal, I'm conservative, and we're very good friends. And the point of the conversation isn't to win, right? It's not to score each other. It's to learn a little bit from one another, from different perspectives. It's one of the single most popular features in the New York Times, and I've noticed it's almost never mentioned on social media, which tells you that the real audience of the Times, and I think the real place where conversations are happening are in spaces like these, which are civil, engaged, passionate, and above all thoughtful, and not in that kind of high decibel echo chamber that we think defines this country and our political life. And we should cherish it, and we should keep it going. And I just end with thanks for people tuning in and spending some time with me.
Well, thank you, Bret. And I would just like to alert our audience to the fact that although there will not be a program next week, the next program, speaking of the New York Times, will feature one of its ace reporters, Peter Baker, and his wife, Susan Glasser of the New Yorker, moderated by Warren Olney. So good night to all, and thank you for joining us.